longer programs with cooperation across departments. There are many courses offered that are almost direct duplications. In other cases, we could combine those courses, make them better, rather than, so when you're talking about ending that kind of duplication, you're not taking anybody's job away or anything of the sort. You're making more effective use of your resources. We have some degree programs that we will never be able to support adequately. The question is what to do about that. Not to personalize, just what are we going to do about that? In Moorland-Spingarn, we have collections that ought to be developed, like the Afro-Brazilian collection, but that could not be developed without a faculty, because all of those books are in Portuguese. If the university does not have a Romance language department that teaches Portuguese, that resource, which Gilberto Freire told me was the best in the world when he visited, is better than anything they have in Brazil. But we have never developed that. Now, that is an academic issue. But I certainly wouldn't think that if Moorland suddenly got a large grant for acquisitions, that we would then start adding to the Afro-Brazilian collection if we don't have faculty at Howard who are doing that, and we're preparing students to go to Brazil and so on and so forth. But you could have a program that involved the history department, political science, and Romance languages, and you could make a decent program out of that. But all you have to do, when I was vice president, I went through a very simple exercise. I looked at all of our programs and those of our competitor institutions. At that time, I do not know the current situation, at that time, we had more academic programs than any other institution in this city. At the time that Georgetown was eliminating its dental school, for example, and I'm not saying we want to eliminate our dental school, but why did President Healy do that? Because he said, Georgetown has been a local Catholic school for the most part. I am going to make it into a research university. Well, there were people in the church who said, well, wait a minute, hold up. We have a Catholic medical school and a Catholic law school. He said, we're going to have a national medical school and a national law school. And Georgetown is the largest law school in the United States. And our undergraduate college will reflect our Catholic values. But if we are going to be important in the United States, we can no longer be seen primarily as a Catholic institution. Now, at the very time that President Healy was raising over $300 million to make that vision real, 244 or 5 or so Catholic colleges closed in the United States. Why did they close? A, they did not adapt to coeducation. B, they did not adapt to the change that Catholic families and their students were now going to secular institutions. And they, in order to stay open, they would have had to have adapted. Now, does that sound familiar? We have to adapt to this new climate. Again, I'm not talking about post-racial nirvana or anything like that, but it is a different climate. When I visit Princeton, when you walk into any office in Princeton now, you can't be sure whether you will see a black secretary, a white secretary, or you go into the history department at Princeton, whether you're going to see a black faculty member or a white faculty member. When I was a student at Howard, you could be sure you were not going to see a black janitor at Princeton. Princeton was a white supremacist institution ever since Woodrow Wilson made it very clear what it was going to be. It was going to be a Southern institution in New Jersey. Well, that's very different now. Princeton is co-ed, and it's got some of the best black faculty in the United States. So our discussions today were very heartening. But to me, it still gets to the point of choice. Which collections in Moorland get developed? what part of Africa do we focus on? What is going on in our African Studies department that needs support from Moorland, and then we get those aligned? What is the research of the faculty in the history department, political science, sociology, and so on, that is relevant to Moorland? No check will answer that question. And I think the key issue for Moorland is leadership. Now, we talked this morning about vision, and we talked about leadership. You need both. But the vision thing can be sometimes stretched out, you know, as you get committees and committees and committees working on vision. Let me tell you a true story. I was minding my business in the history department one day, actually doing some copy editing on a manuscript, and the department secretary said, President Cheek wants to see you right now. So I went over to see President Cheek. It was about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He wants me to leave the department and come to Moorland. He told me about Mrs. Porter's retirement pending and what was going to happen there. So I said, well, first place, Mr. President, I can't leave the department. I would have to take a temporary leave. He agreed to that. That leave evolved into the longest leave in the history of the university. The only thing I ever exceeded Ralph Bunch in was my leave. He had the record before Michael Winston. So we talked, and I was very flattered, stunned. Then he said this, I have to go downtown this week to the appropriations committees. I want on my desk tomorrow morning at the opening of business, which is 8:30 in this office, a plan and a budget. I went home and sketched out Moorland-Spingarn ought to have manuscript division with these departments. It ought to have a library division. It ought to include the university archives, because we don't have one, and we ought to have one. And it ought to include a university museum that we can incubate and then develop as a separate organization. And then I gave him an elephant of a budget with the idea, well, he will cut it, of course. He gave me every dime. And there was nothing to do but do it. Now, this is another true story. The first day, you might wonder, what did Winston do the first day in Moorland? I shocked the staff. I said, we are going to clean this place up. And we got buckets. And we cleaned the place up because it wasn't clean. And I wasn't going to write out an order and a request and this and that and get physical plant and have an act of Congress to get the place clean. We cleaned it up. And then we started working on getting together a staff. And I was convinced that they needed to be young people who were going, all of them, to go back to school. Now, of course, that was not very popular with some of the people already there. But I already have my degree, I said. What you have is fine for working in a general library. It is not for a research library. You need a subject master's degree at least. And it's my preference if everybody on the staff gets a doctorate. Because that is what you have in research libraries. And gradually, you know, the first week I sent out a memo on how I wanted the phones answered. Don't insult us, Dr. Winston. You know how to answer the phone. You don't know how to answer it the way I want.